But yeah, we're going to talk right now about developing a business case, right? That was one of the concepts in this webinar as well, that, fine and good, but what do I, as an ITAM manager or SAM manager or member of the department or manager of the entire program, how do I approach this, right? What pieces do I need to put together so that I can help construct a business case for saying, this is important in the organization, it deserves some attention, if not some invest in resources. First, define your problem. We're taking a very logical and data-driven approach, as you'll see through these subsequent boxes here. But the first thing that you want to do is look at your publisher spend and risk data. You do not want to go spinning your wheels and chasing something that ultimately ends up being kind of a wild goose chase, or something that's not going to add value, or even worse, be misaligned with your organization's priorities, right? So really look at all of the spend information. I would recommend you look at raw procurement information as opposed to looking at just kind of onesie twosie reseller reports. You should look at it all, but I think you should start with your kind of centralized procurement sources of information, or your ERP systems, as much as possible, and then kind of add on and bolt on reseller reports as needed. Also consider your risk, right? So do some research, look at BSA, SIA, FAST, any kind of the compliance organizations. See which of your top publishers where you have a lot of spend are members of those organizations and are interested in compliance. We'll kind of say it that way, to where you have your risk, right? And then kind of look at your the kind of depth of the problem. And that's kind of what we talk about here. Based on your priorities, determine your focus. If your priority for your program is, right, we are interested in risk mitigation, and how is everything supporting risk mitigation? And info security, they're supporting risk mitigation this way, and this other big initiative is supporting risk mitigation this way. If you turn up to the organization and say, well, we're doing cost control, you need to have that aligned, right? So Taylor, that's going to go a little bit in the direction of your question. We'll get to that in a second, but you want to make sure that you are adding value according to what is defined as valuable for your organization. So if your organization says cost control, well, how are you going to support cost control, right? Your largest spend, how do you make that the smallest? How do you optimize your estate? If it's risk mitigation, then the riskiest publishers you should tackle first, right? Determine what focus out of those SaaS publishers will be based on the priorities of your organization that drive your ITAM program. Do a gap analysis. So based on that defined and sized problem, let's say you've got five top publishers you're going to look at. What are your current capabilities, and what are those requirements from the publisher? Do you have to go after transactional level data? Do you have to go after number of terabytes being backed up and something else? What kind of data points and what kind of measurement capabilities are there versus what needs to be there? So do that gap analysis. Then define your end state, right? This all kind of fits in, because you're saying, okay, we have priorities, we have a problem, and we've got a gap analysis. Well, where do we want to end up? Do we want it to be a little bit simpler? Do we want it to be fully automated, integrated, end-to-end, fancy reporting XYZ? Use that gap analysis and feed that in, and make sure you're including this in your ITAM roadmap, right? SaaS is going to be a subset of how you're handling the larger software estate. Help build out that business case, right, based on what your roadmap looks like, and that should be driven by your priorities. Define your ask. You should have an executive sponsor for your program. Should not be just a team of people with no linkage to senior management. Whoever your executive sponsor or manager or manager's manager is, you should leverage that person to help communicate that business case. Again, defined, sized, data-driven. You've done your homework, you've done your gap analysis, you've defined where you want to end up. It's all aligned with your program. Make sure they support communicating that, and then demonstrate that value. Assuming you can get the resources, this is then the flip side. They're going to spend and outlay some resource, maybe give you an extra person, spend some money on a tool, use your existing KPIs in your program to say, look, in the area of SaaS, here's what we're doing, and then communicate widely. Make sure you share your success and say, here's what we are doing. So there's a brief on some next steps, and then we will get to Q&As because we're kind of rapidly running out of time here. So again, great, well and good. But what now? Where do we start? How do we really get our arms around this, right? Even outside of doing the business case to make sure this is something that you can focus resource-wise on in your organization. What do I do as an ITAM manager, as a SAM manager? Number one, it should always start with data, trustworthy data. That's going to drive your actionable recommendations to the business. That's what you want to do. We talked about purchasing data. So look at your ERP systems with procurement and sourcing, look at some reseller reports, get as complete as possible a view on what you're purchasing. And then look at installation and usage, right? Look at your ITAM repository, look at some of the publisher portals, think about what gaps in solutioning you have, but you need to understand from both pillars what your data is and what kind of the known unknown, right? If you have a gap, that's okay, but you need to be able to triangulate that and say, okay, I know we have a gap in capability. We're zooming in and focusing here. So make sure you nail your trustworthy data, number one. That will also drive a lot of those other activities, namely looking at publisher prioritization, kind of aligning your approach, et cetera. Then number two, think about your existing estate. If you have conformant SaaS, how do you approach that? How do you optimize that? How do you mitigate? How do you get ahead of some of those renewals? Sorry, I'm going really rapid fire, but I'm kind of throwing out some of the things that you'll need to be doing. And then on the shadow SaaS side, you will, it's more of a when rather than if, you will run into instances that are unauthorized. And then how do you rationalize those, right? You need to apply your policy and say, this is not allowed. You are not going to be reimbursed for your renewal. And you need to go back through the review process to make sure that this is not a security risk for the organization. Or if this is really bad, there needs to be some kind of enforcement mechanism that is triggered and enforced in a uniform way. And then thinking about developing a governance framework. What will your operating model be, driven by your policies and your processes? Who is allowed to spin up SaaS? Who has visibility to this? Who helps manage that life cycle of those instances? And then that is underpinned by that steering committee. They are going to approve the model, approve the framework, very similar to how you operate with other areas of software, but in as much as they're managing and supporting the management of the ITAM program, that steering committee is going to be very valuable.